But I can tell you, nobody is interested enough to punish Britain, and I would defy you to provide an example of that happening.
Oh, well, I could provide dozens of examples because while I was at Oxford, and the reason why I went there was because I was the sort of token Brexiteer in the politics department. So every visitor, literally every political visitor that came over from the EU to talk to us acknowledged that they did want to punish.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 149 for the 5th of January 2023. I've got a proposal for tax reform. The idea is to make tax easier and simpler to understand, simpler for the government to collect, and thereby lower costs, which would lower the overall tax burden eventually. We have a whole load of sales taxes in Ireland. We have VAT, we have excise duty, we have VRT, stamp duty. And all of these are complex to administer, they're difficult to comply with, and so to simplify everything, I'm recommending to the new incoming Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, that he start off 2023 by scrapping them all and replacing them with one simple, easy to understand tax that will make life better for everyone. It'll be fairer, it'll be transparent, and I think people will welcome it. The idea is a toilet paper tax. I've calculated that the tax will be about €100 per roll, and this will bring in enough money to cover the abolition of all of the other sales taxes. So people's tax rates will stay the same. The €100 per roll tax that they're paying will be offset by the reduction in taxes that they pay on other goods and services. And, as I say, its simplicity should bring down the total tax burden over time. Everybody needs toilet paper, so nobody can escape the tax. And the only difference will be that it's easy for everyone to understand, it's easy to administer, so in the long run it'll save us all time, hassle and money. It's a no-brainer.
Oh, wow. Hello there, all of you in January 2023. You won't believe what happened. Firstly, Leo Varadkar accepted my proposal for abolishing all sales taxes and replacing them with a single, simple, easy to administer €100 tax on each roll of toilet paper. But the really crazy thing is that some sort of vortex in the space-time continuum was created by the ghost of Steve Jobs in an advanced Apple research laboratory. It was intended to move their corporate profits back in time to before the global minimum tax rate of 15%, to before that, when that was introduced. But just as I was coming out of the meeting with Leo Varadkar at Fine Gael headquarters to explain details of my innovative tax plan, the Apple executive recruitment team were going in to meet him. I've no idea why, but one of them sneezed in front of a portrait of W.T. Cosgrave. They dropped their space-time continuum manipulation device and it bit my portable podcast recorder, and this somehow allows me to actually speak to you back in time in January from here in March 2023, which is when I'm reporting from. Anyway, all those other taxes are going to be abolished from the end of March, and starting on the first day of the next month, they will be replaced by a €100 tax on each roll of toilet paper. I'm sure it's going to be a huge improvement. Okay, so I'm speaking to you now through the Apple Space-Time Continuum Vortex Recorder from the future. It's the start of May 2023, and we've had the new system of scrapping all sales taxes in favour of a single, simple toilet roll tax in place for just over a month, and it's going fine with some teething problems. Obviously, there have been great advantages, of course. Taxes on loads of products have been reduced. That'll be a boon to the economy soon. But the toilet paper tax receipts are below projections. Apparently, people have made a lot of efforts to reduce their use of toilet paper, and sales are down considerably. But to make up for that, the government is setting the toilet paper tax to €200 per roll. Anyway, sales are way up on other things that are tax-free now, like hand sanitizer. Me again, via the space-time continuum vortex recorder. It's the middle of June now, so hello to you guys in January 2023, from the future, I guess, for you. There have been some more teething problems with the brilliant new simplified toilet roll tax. It seems that some people were cheating on their taxes by buying kitchen roll and using it as toilet paper. This has caused the kitchen roll aisles in the supermarkets to be emptied, but I think that it's important not to give in to criminality, so the government has implemented a few moderate control measures. Firstly, people will only be allowed to buy one roll of kitchen roll per week, and a new ID system along with kitchen roll vouchers is being introduced to enforce this. There will also be some random spot checks in homes and offices, with a stiff fine for anyone found to have kitchen rolls stored within 5 metres of their bathroom. The toilet roll tax will be increased to €275 per roll to cover the costs associated with the kitchen roll tax evasion scandal and the new measures to prevent abuse of the system and the extra staff to carry out inspections. Hello again. The space-time continuum vortex is bringing you my voice from now, the start of July 2023. Hello to you folks in January. I'm speaking to you from the corporate headquarters of the Office for the Control of Toilet Paper. This is a new government agency that was thought to be fitting given the importance of toilet paper in the economy, and as an expert in the field, I have been appointed as the chief executive. I can assure you that issues with the toilet paper control website are now being addressed, and it is unfortunate that the toilet paper control app has not yet been finalised. I am assured that it will be working shortly, and I would urge people not to give any credit to irrelevant details like the fact that the app was developed by a company incorporated last month by my 14-year-old nephew. Once it is up and running, people will then easily be able to use kitchen roll for its intended purposes and upload evidence of this, including a photo of the QR code that's now printed on each sheet of kitchen paper, in order to claim the disposable nutritional use paper cleansing tax refund. This simple compliance system of collecting toilet roll paper tax on kitchen roll as well, and then making a refund when the taxpayer uploads photographic evidence of its authorised use in a non-personal posterior capacity. I'm talking to you from the dog days of August, and we've all heard of the Supreme Court ruling in the Wutherington Gilhooly case, but maybe you back in January might not be familiar with it. Basically, the court ruled in favour of Maud Wutherington Gilhooly, an 83-year-old grandaunt who lived in a small cottage in Borris-in-Ossory. She took a case arguing that her house was so small that the bathroom was only 4.7 metres away from the kitchen, and that she couldn't reasonably be required to store her kitchen roll more than 5 metres from her bathroom, and that her constitutional right to privacy meant that the order to attend smartphone lessons to be able to use the kitchen roll refund app was invalid, and the subsequent raid by 27 members of the Garda Emergency Response Unit searching her home was illegal. Ridiculous judicial interference. Although I would have to agree that manacling Miss Wutherington Gilhooly to her walking frame was perhaps excessive. I am told, though, by reliable sources that the government is about to launch an assistance fund to help inhabitants of smaller houses to build kitchen extensions to allow them to comply with the law. Hello there, January listeners. Me again with the Space-Time Continuum Vortex Recorder. It's September 2023 now, and of course the airwaves have been filled with the new maxi-roll issue. an IFSC-based consultancy specialising in corporate tax avoidance, has turned itself into a paper factory making toilet roll over 1 kilometre long, weighing nearly 40 kilos, but still only attracting one payment of the €590 tax. I'm assured that proposals will go before Cabinet to bring in emergency legislation to curb this clearly abusive behaviour. There are those who are demanding that this entire progressive, simplifying reform be scrapped, but to them I say this: any complaint that you have about the toilet roll tax will be magnified 1,000 times if you were to accept the crackpot idea of imposing sales taxes on all consumer goods. Well, that was an eventful October. Just after King Charles, no, it doesn't sound normal now either. Just after King Charles appointed his 7th UK Prime Minister in over a year, a major cross-border toilet paper smuggling ring was busted. This was a sophisticated operation with a tunnel from Newry to Dundalk with a continuous spindle of toilet paper being sent southwards. Gardaí have said that there appears to be the involvement of former paramilitaries in this smuggling operation. I know that there have been setbacks and people complain about the €750 toilet roll tax, but think of the benefits that we see all around. I'm particularly heartened by the improvement in the performance of Irish media, for example. Hello again, the Space-Time Continuum Vortex Recorder is bringing you my voice from the end of November 2023. And I think that all right-thinking people will condemn the bleeding heart special criminal court justices and their ruling that since the sophisticated cross-border smuggling was of a single continuous spindle of toilet roll, and that since its transport across the border had not actually been completed, then no crime was committed. On another note, I have to acknowledge an element of disappointment that the surge in the sales of Irish newspapers does not now seem to stem from an uptick in interest of the citizens in current affairs, but that at least part of the reason for the increase of the toilet roll tax to €995 is because people have been putting the newsprint to, let's just say, to uses that it wasn't intended for. And I'm absolutely not amused by the comments about this improving the quality of some Irish Times columnists. Hello, I'm in December 2023 and it seems that the judges have attacked the modest €1,200 toilet roll tax again, and this time it seems that they will succeed in killing this progressive, forward-looking initiative. The Supreme Court case taken by the Vegetarian Society on grounds of discrimination has been upheld. When the judges got to the point where it was proposed to have a demonstration in court involving devices to weigh and make an olfactory examination, they obviously had enough, and they immediately issued a unanimous ruling that under Section 39 of the Constitution that Ireland must go back to the pre-2023 taxation nightmare where taxes were levied on almost all goods sold. But Section 39 is about treason.
Back to sanity, relatively speaking. The thing is, some things just can't be simple. In particular, our taxation system can't be simple because our economy is very complex. And if you tax one area of the economy and you don't tax another, you will make perverse incentives that distort economic activity. And that's exactly what we do in Ireland. We tax labour and economic activity much more heavily in order to avoid taxing housing. That pushes talent, capital, initiative, effort, and ingenuity into the zero-sum game of property speculation. And it deters real economic activity and punishes hard work. Why is childcare so expensive in Ireland? Because the input is almost all work, which is taxed so heavily, and the childcare costs have to be paid out of the parent's taxed income, so it gets run through the taxation system twice. And why is housing so expensive in Ireland? Because, unlike labour, you can't make new land. So the people who have it have a huge advantage over the people who need it. And the people who have it are powerfully motivated to make sure that it's never taxed so they can hoard it forever for free. And the left-wing politicians who say, scrap this tax and scrap that tax, I just can't understand them. Having one area of the economy taxed and another not taxed is a recipe for disaster. And at the focal point of that disaster are the people who are paying huge mortgages or rents and paying huge childcare bills. They're probably the hardest pressed people in the country, and they're being squeezed by the most idiotically populist policy in the country to not have a property tax like every other developed country, and instead to heap all of our tax base onto work and economic enterprise. It's actually more nuts than having €100 toilet paper tax. In a moment we'll have the interview, but first I want to say thanks to all of our patrons on Patreon. I really appreciate everyone who donates. It pays for the various costs of getting the podcast online, and Kevin and myself basically donate our time for free. By the way, I'm always happy when we get a new patron on Patreon. It lets us know that there are people out there listening and appreciating the podcast. We make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in Irish media. You're more than welcome to listen for free, but if you think that you could make your New Year's resolution to do the same as the other donors and throw in the price of a postage stamp or even the price of a breakfast roll once a month, there's details how to do that on the website and at the end of the show.
Rate and review the show on iTunes and other podcast providers. Share it on Facebook and Twitter, but most of all, tell your friends.
On the line I have Brooks Newmark. Brooks was a British Conservative Party MP for the constituency of Braintree for 10 years. He was also Lord Commissioner of the Treasury and later Minister for Civil Society under David Cameron's government. Brooks, I know you left Parliament after an expose in the Daily Mirror. I'm not so interested in that. I'm more interested maybe in what you've been doing since you left Parliament. And I know that you were a research associate in Oxford. You're now a PhD candidate there. That's in the Department of Politics and International Relations. And if you look at your CV, it's very internationally focused, both when you were in politics and since you left politics. Do you think that that outlook is shared by a lot of the British media and the political establishment?
Well, it depends which outlook in particular. I have been in the politics department at Oxford, but in fact, I'm doing my doctorate in education and education policy in Rwanda. But you're right. I sort of went into politics originally because I had a business background, and there were really not that many people with business experience going into politics. They tended to be special advisors and people who'd been researchers for the party and so on, and or even maybe lawyers. But there weren't that many people with business experience. So I actually went in when I was in my mid-40s. So I'd had a good 20 years plus of business experience. I almost fell into international politics accidentally because there's never a guarantee you're going to end up where you want to be, which in my case was the Treasury, which in fact I really never ended up in. So I started focusing on international relations, and my particular interest early on was the Middle East, and I spent a lot of time looking at the relationship between Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, and really spent a huge amount of time focusing in on that. That ultimately led to a broader interest in then Russia and what Russia was doing, and
I guess this flows from Russia's interest in Syria.
Exactly right. Yeah, Russia's intervention in Syria, and then their basically illegal annexation of Crimea. And I sort of became a harsh critic of Putin. And I met a guy called Bill Browder who wrote this book called Red Notice. In 2014, I sort of began proposing the equivalent of a Magnitsky list, which is trying to identify the oligarchs around Putin and saying we need to stop them from being able to travel to the UK in particular. I also said we need to target their wives and children. They shouldn't come and shop here, and education. And I became
for the listeners, just to clarify, the Magnitsky list. This is named after a lawyer who died in prison in Russia because he was representing someone who Putin didn't like, and he was essentially tortured and mistreated to death. And in his honor, in the US and also now in several other countries, including Ireland, sanctions on individual people. That idea was developed, that you don't have sanctions on the whole country. You actually say that person there, that business here, they can't do business in the West.
Yeah, it's sort of difficult to put pressure on any political leader, and a way to do that with somebody like Putin is through the people that are close to him and associated with him, and in Putin's case, the people who he uses to launder a lot of his own money. So he has a financial relationship with pretty much all the people that are identified on this Magnitsky list. And if your readers are interested to know a little bit more of the background of this, I'd highly recommend reading this book called Red Notice by Bill Browder. But anyway, I had the honor in 2014, because of my criticisms of Putin and of Bashar Assad, to ultimately being banned in 3 countries, Russia, Iran, and Syria, all in 2014. So I sort of maintained my interest in the sort of international area, not just the Middle East, but increasingly what Russia was doing in Ukraine. And I don't know if we're going to end up talking about this, but when the war started in Ukraine earlier this year, I ended up deciding to go in and start evacuating women and children away from the war zone. And over the past 8 to 9 months, I've ended up moving over 20,000 women and children away from the war zone, albeit keeping them in Ukraine, but somewhere safer than where they were. So I actually sort of accidentally fell into my interest in international affairs and international relations.
You've done very well for having fallen into it. You also, I know, have interests in development in Africa. Just looking at your CV, there's no question that you have demonstrated in a very concrete terms both understanding and actual interest, and willing to, get dirt under your fingernails in terms of international relations. One of the things that we in Ireland kind of see sometimes almost exasperatedly is that that's not common in British politics. That we tend to see, and it's perhaps hits the headlines, and a standout example, although I think there are a lot more mundane examples, but a standout example is that Karen Bradley, your formerly colleague as a Conservative Party MP, was sent to Northern Ireland as the Northern Ireland Secretary, which would be the minister in the British cabinet responsible for Northern Ireland, and showed up and said that she wasn't aware that Catholics and Protestants, that nationalists and unionists in Northern Ireland tended to vote for different political parties along ethnic religious lines. And I would have thought, certainly for someone in Ireland, I would have thought for anybody with any knowledge at all of it, is just staggeringly ignorant for any elected politician in a country where, in theory, in law and in international law, Northern Ireland is part of the UK. But for the person who's the minister, did you have any experience, or do you think that my perception on that is right?
Your perception is 100% spot on. I found it very frustrating as a person who'd come into politics from the outside and from business that, the people who tended to get promoted in politics, I found, were people who were friends of, close to people who ended up getting into power. Rarely did you find people getting promoted because they were round pegs in round holes. I would say an example of a round peg in a round hole would be somebody like Nick Gibb in education, who is very focused on education and has continued to do a good job in that. I'd say probably, actually, to be honest, I think Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak, in their sort of respective chancellor roles, have good economic and business experience and are round pegs and round holes. But you're absolutely right. I think particularly when it comes to foreign affairs, and I'd probably say William Hague is one of the exceptions to that rule. There aren't people who just have an innate curiosity to learn and indeed to problem solve. And I love traveling. I love going to countries. I love traveling around and meeting people to better understand those countries. And I'll never forget one expression when I first went to Lebanon, which was when I came back after my time there. And I said, you know what, the more I learn, the more I realize I don't understand. And the person who was Lebanese said, that's exactly right. People who think that they go to a country and then feel they understand all the problems immediately having been there, really don't understand. And I think having grown up, and I'm 64, with the whole area of the Troubles and Northern Ireland and the IRA and the loyalists and everything. So, you grow up with a sensitivity to it. But even now, I would profess ignorance on the subject, although I'd hasten to add I probably wouldn't be as ignorant as Karen Bradley. But I have to say it is an incredibly complex issue, and people, and I'm not just saying whether it's the Republic of Ireland and the North and what goes on with the North and the history of the North. But I think that if one takes on a job like that, certainly with me, as I would have done in business, you sit down with as many experts as you can. You read as much as you can. But most importantly for me, and I do this in business, is that I try and get as many opposing views as I can, because I like to be intellectually challenged and I want to be able to understand. And, the default always is trying to come up with simple solutions for very complex problems.
That's a dangerous thing to go for, but I want to maybe see if you can give me somewhat of a reality check and tell me whether my thesis is misconceived. And you will know, and you have a very international outlook, you will know that there is a refrain in Britain about Britain being the closest ally of the United States. And probably in Britain, they don't like to hear quite as much that they're not the only people who say that. And if you go to France, they say that they are America's oldest ally. And if you go to Israel, they will say that they're the United States' closest ally. And when you have a superpower like that, all the people want to sort of latch on and be their acolytes to get the reflected glory. And I'm wondering whether my perception that Britain's understanding, their appreciation of Ireland, and I don't mean just, the regular person on the Clapham omnibus, I mean people in the political media establishment, seem to have a blind spot, and journalists and politicians who, for example, know the difference between the pronunciation of Kiev and Kyiv and know why it's important, seem to have a startling level of ignorance about Ireland. Karen Bradley is a standout. She's a standout example, but she's by no means alone in that. And I'm just wondering, is there some sort of post-colonial thing going on there that they are almost proud of not knowing it, or perhaps are too grudging to accept Ireland as another country on the international field as opposed to a former colony?
Well, I think that, because of not just its proximity, but our history with Ireland, I think there's perhaps an intellectual laziness, and that it's more the other way around. People think that they know, and therefore feel comfortable in perhaps making quick judgments or snap judgments or equally important snap observations about what's going on instead of really understanding that there is a continual dynamic, as I say, between the relationship between the North and the South, as well as the relationship between the island, and I'll refer to that way, of Ireland, and its relationship with the rest of the United Kingdom. And it is constantly changing.
I'm going to pause you there on the words, the rest of the United Kingdom.
Yeah, because people tend to look at the north of Ireland in a specific way as distinct from the south. I tend to, because I'm an outsider, as I said, I was originally from the States, I probably have a look at things through a different lens, and I look at Ireland as a whole and have, in many ways, have always done so. So I haven't tended to look at it in the divisive terms in which it's become. And I'm someone who's always said that they would respect the decision of the majority in the North, for example. If they decided to return and become part of the whole of Ireland, that would be something I personally would always be perfectly comfortable with. It's up for the people of the North to decide that. In the same way, I would say the same with Scotland. I feel the same way there. Nobody has a God-given right to say that this country continues forever to belong to another part of a country. It is in many ways, a voluntary association. Now, notwithstanding that, I do believe in the United Kingdom, and I do support, and I would continue to support the Union. And when I say the Union, I mean the Union both of Scotland with the rest of the United Kingdom and the north of Ireland as part of the United Kingdom. But as I said, intellectually, I'm flexible enough and understanding enough to know that things do change on the ground, and we have to respect that change. It's like a marriage. Marriages don't necessarily need to last forever, and it's up for both sides to continue to work at that relationship. And if there is a relationship breakdown, there's no reason why people shouldn't get divorce. And this concept of what I refer to as political coercive control, where people make threats that if you don't remain part of this union of marriage or this political union, then you will suffer for that. An extreme example now that I'm seeing internationally, obviously, is the relationship that Russia sees as with Ukraine, which it feels it was a mistake that Ukraine ever split away from Russia, and it is naturally a Slavic country and should be part of the rest of Russia. So, it is something I'm sensitive to, but, I wouldn't be, I'm far from being an expert on, as I said, the Republic of Ireland versus what's going on in the north of Ireland and the relationship between the north and the rest of the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland itself and its relationship with the United Kingdom.
Okay. On that, I know you had left Parliament at the time of the Brexit referendum in 2016. Did you campaign on Brexit?
I did, yes. I was very, very, very pro-Brexit.
Okay. That sounds surprising in the context of everything else you say. Maybe that's a compliment. Maybe it's not. But on the whole, looking back, do you think that Brexit has made Britain have a more internationalist outlook? I think,
okay, so as somebody, so you sort of say that. So this idea...
No, that's a question.
No, I just want to answer your question in a slightly different way, in a political way to begin with. When I talk about political coercive control, so Britain, the United Kingdom's relationship with Europe became unhappier and unhappier. And so we said, we've had enough. We want to break that relationship up. We don't want to be part of the EU, but we want a good relationship with you. The other party, and I'll say the EU itself, said, well, we can't have you do that, and therefore we're going to punish you. and we're going to make life as uncomfortable as possible for you.
I got to stop you, Brooks. I've really got to stop you, and I will allow you to answer. Allow me to.
Hold on. I'm not here to have a debate with you. I'm just explaining my position.
Okay, go on, and then I'll challenge you. Go ahead. Finish, and then I'll challenge you.
I'm simply explaining my position there. So the question is, it for me became one of who rules Britain, and so my decision was based on a political decision that I didn't want to have our an ever closer political union with Europe, which is why I supported Brexit. It was not due to any economic imperative or anything like that. It was purely a political imperative. And so that's what sort of drove me to support Brexit. Now, your broader question is, has it been worthwhile? Have we benefited and so on? The thing is, it's been very difficult because, in a post-Brexit environment, we then suddenly were hit with COVID and the war in Ukraine. So it's very difficult, I think, to unpick what has been the impact of Brexit versus what's been going on more globally. Would I vote the same way again? And the answer would be yes, for the very reason I gave to you at the beginning of my mini soliloquy.
Okay, then having heard your mini soliloquy, thank you very much for that. The thing I wanted to challenge you on. So first of all, you say it's hard to unpick. Yeah. It's not that hard to unpick because you can look at the economic downturn and recovery pre and post COVID in the UK and compare it to the rest of the G7. And there's no question that the rest of the G7 have had their challenges with Putin and the war in Ukraine, have had their challenges with COVID in the same way that the UK has, but they haven't had Brexit. And there's no question that the economic performance of the UK has pre-Brexit gone from the top of the G7 spread to the bottom. So that does tend to suggest that Brexit hasn't been that successful. But the real thing I wanted to challenge you on was the notion of punishment. And I hedged my question about the attitude to Ireland in Britain because people sometimes are least well able to make a detached judgment about themselves and so forth. But I've got to say, I've heard this so many times, and it sounds like the greatest load of nonsense I've ever heard. The notion that anyone anywhere in Europe, least of all people in government, have the slightest interest in punishing Britain, to me is just off the wall. There is nobody there punishing Britain. There are people who are very, very exasperated and very, very angry at the unprofessional way in which particularly the withdrawal agreement was handled. And I will give you one particular quote from an Irish Department of Foreign Affairs official. The Irish Department of Foreign Affairs is not a great international institution. They are highly aware of the fact that they don't have any gunboats in order to do gunboat diplomacy, and they need to be nice to people, and they will be unbelievably polite to anybody they come across. But when they're coming back and saying that the first 80% of any meeting that they have with the British is devoted to remedial lessons on how international trade works, that is a withering comment. And for that comment to be allowed to be published says an awful lot about the way in which that was conducted. But I can tell you, nobody is interested enough to punish Britain, and I would defy you to provide an example of that happening.
Oh, well, I could provide dozens of examples because while I was at Oxford, and the reason why I went there was because I was the sort of token Brexiteer in the politics department. So every visitor, literally every political visitor that came over from the EU to talk to us acknowledged that they did want to punish, and I use the word punish Britain, because they don't want to set a precedent for other countries wanting to have their own version of Brexit. And there were people from Holland, I remember, specifically saying in the debate we had in St. Anthony's, yes, we do want to punish Britain. Similar from Germany, similar from France. There were any time.
Is this in published comments?
But these are not published comments. These are in discussions about the EU and about at the time of Brexit, when Britain was wanting to leave, of wanting to punish us because they did not want to make life easy for anybody else who would ever want to leave. So I think this sort of pro-Remain narrative, which is what you've got, looks through things in an equally distorted lens. And you don't need to have this sort of sense of outrage when you talk to people who have a different point of view. And this is the problem I find with many of the people on the Remain side, is the sort of toxic narrative that seems to develop over what different people perceive as facts on the ground. Now, I can go to the other two examples that people have tended to use. One is this, I think it was this 365 million pounds a day, right? And I really want to unpick this because this is something so many Remainers point to, which is this 19 billion figure. So when you look at what Britain's contribution was to the EU, it was 19 billion, which was 365 million pounds a week. That is the gross figure, right? So nobody can argue and say that 365 figure is a wrong figure. But the argument that the other side used, which is not an unreasonable argument, completely understand it, is that is a gross figure, not a net figure, because net was a figure roughly 9 billion pounds less, because the EU recycled that money back into the UK. The difference was, of course, was that 9 billion being recycled back into the UK was a decision made by the EU as to where that money should go. Mm-hmm. And so that's where that sort of argument goes. The second argument, again, which was, and I can't remember what the figure was, I think it was 40 odd billion into the NHS or something like that, which in the end, under Theresa May, net, that amount of money did go in as an increase. So even though the huffing and puffing of some of the figures that many Remainers have argued against those that were promoting Brexit at the time, I'm afraid I would say the facts on the ground are different. Now, the third area, which I do sympathize with and agree with those on the Remain side, was the toxic nature of the immigration narrative. And as someone who is an immigrant myself here and whose family parents ultimately immigrated from Eastern Europe originally to the United States, I've always been a very pro-immigration Tory. And I've always argued that Theresa May was wrong, as is the current Home Secretary, in trying to cap immigration. You cannot have growth in a country, which is what we're seeking. You cannot have economic growth without having a strong amount of immigration. Immigrants are net productive members of our society, and immigrants don't come to this country, our country, because of the, quote, generosity of our benefit system. They come here because they want to be productive members of society and make a better life for themselves. So as a conservative, I've always been a very pro-immigration conservative.
Okay, you have given us our Brexit pitch. I suspect it may be perhaps lost because I'm not a Remainer, as you suggest. I'm not a Brexiteer. I'm not British at all. So it just doesn't count. And I have no vote in that, no vote in that referendum, and I have no dog in that fight.
My comment, you reacted quite emotionally to my comment, which is the emotional way a lot of Remainers would have reacted. So I apologize if you're not a Remainer.
I have no dog in that fight. I would observe that many Brexiteers, such as Daniel Hannan and Nigel Farage, said absolutely explicitly that the UK would remain within the single market. And I think that the difficulty that has arisen since Brexit, most of the difficulties focus around the difficulties of Britain leaving the single market and still having an integrated economy, particularly an integrated economy between the north and the south of Ireland. But that's a whole different debate. And it's not a debate that I want to get into, because what I think is interesting to talk to you about is the actual difference between what the people in the UK perceive to be an attack on them or punishment for them and reality. And I would highlight one particular tendency, if you look at the British popular press, there is regular stories, and you'll get this on social media as well, whereby there is an EU queue for passports and there is a non-EU queue for passports when you're going into airports in various EU countries. Ireland doesn't do this because of the common travel area, but that's a separate issue. And you will have people explicitly saying they are punishing us by not allowing us to queue in the shorter EU queue for passports where there's a much more cursory check. However, and just to compare that to just a single case of a young Italian woman, I think late teens, early 20s, I don't remember the exact age, but certainly a very young woman who shortly after Brexit became effective was coming to be a childminder for her cousin who was a doctor in a hospital in the UK. So he's an Italian doctor. He was entirely legally working, had settled status in the UK. She arrives and entirely correctly presents herself to the immigration authorities and says that she's going to be a childminder there and has a letter to confirm this from her cousin who is a doctor and legally resident and working in the UK. The people who are processing the queue for people arriving for employment purposes tell her that this is not sufficient documentation to show that she has a job, but she can enter through, because she can stay in the UK for 90 days, she can enter through the normal tourist queue. She goes, joins the other queue, tells exactly the same story, and on the strength of the letter that she has saying she's going to be a childminder and having told the same story, is then locked up in what any reasonable person would view as a prison, has her phone confiscated, has most of her belongings confiscated, and stays in what is supposedly an immigration detention centre. Any reasonable person would recognise it as a prison, before she's deported a week later. What I'm essentially asking, I should put a question at the end of that, and the question I'm putting at the end of that is, can you see how disproportionate it seems to anybody outside Britain when you look at the complaints that British people are making and attributing to punishment, as you put it, Britain being punished for leaving the EU?
Yeah, I guess I'd make three observations. First of all, I think it's appalling. I think the Home Office itself is not fit for purpose, has never been fit for purpose, and always punishes those that stick by the rules and seems to be weak by those that break the rules. That's certainly my first observation. My second observation is that I had an American friend of mine who was coming to visit her mum. Her mum was sick. It was in her early 90s. Both her sisters are living here, have children here, are married here. She came over to visit her sick mum. There's this 6-month rule. She went to Italy for like a week, came back into the UK and had the same experience that, oh, you're trying to sort of live here. She's a multimillionaire, by the way. You're trying to live here. You're trying to stay here. She was, again, same experience, locked up, had her passport taken, and treated, to me, appallingly. And frankly, if I hadn't been an MP at the time and it was Labour in power, and I called up the Home Office minister at the time, and I said to her, this is an appalling treatment of this person who has no intention to live here and stuff. So I guess my first observation is this is less to do with Brexit than to do with, I think, the behaviour of the Home Office, which I say is not fit for purpose. The second point I would make is anybody who travels to the United States has often found themselves in the same situation. I think the American.
Sure, I understand that, Brooke. But Brooke, I want you to deal with the issue.
But I don't. I'm not going to say this is a Brexit issue. I do think that your very first point, I would agree with. There is this whinging narrative that you're right. That why do we have to be in the other, quote, the other line? And I'm afraid that's a decision that, if people made and voted for Brexit, that is a price they have to pay. Now, for me, if was in politics and I was trying to work with the EU, of course, I would say this is nonsense, that they should have, for example, like Portugal. So when I went to Portugal recently, there is a separate line that the Brits do go through because the Portuguese have a reasonable approach to to Brexit and to treating British.
No, but Brooke, I'm going to have to pause you. Brooke, I'm going to have to pause you because all of this lecturing about which country should have a reasonable or more reasonable attitude, that may well be interesting, but it's not Britain's place to lecture Spain or Portugal on the relative merits of their immigration systems. But hold on for a second. The issue is that Britain is out of the EU and each of those countries will do as they jolly well please without reference to Britain. And Britain is not a country that has anything to boast about on that. And people...
I'm agreeing with you. I mean, don't pick an argument when there is no...
Apply then that to trade.
Sorry?
Apply that principle to trade.
So this is my view on trade. if we want to drill down on that, on the very day that we left the EU, we complied 100% on every single EU rule for goods and services. Okay, it would have been far simpler to simply say we continue that relationship, except where, for example, the EU changes a particular rule on a particular goods and services. At that stage, with that particular good, we can then decide, do we wish to comply or not? If we do not comply, then we have to jump through the hoops that everybody else would go through. You know, if one wanted, and I'm saying if one wanted a good trading relationship with the UK, which was a large trading partner with the rest of the EU, there would have been, in my view, a slightly more reasonable approach to this. To try and throw roadblocks in the way on the import and export of meat pies between the north and the south of Ireland because of what the content of said meat pies might contain is an absurdity.
Okay, hold on for a second. There's a reason that didn't happen, Brooks, and the reason it didn't happen is because it is against international law.
Reasonable. No, but I'm trying to get to yes, okay? Mm-hmm. There is a way that people can work to try and accommodate with each other, or they can say, we're going to make life as difficult for you as possible. And you seem to be buying into this narrative that it's okay to begin reforming a relationship going forward. As I said, I go back to the marriage example. We can either have a difficult relationship with each other or not. My belief is that the EU has chosen to take a path which is, because you're daring to leave me, I'm going to make life as difficult for you as possible. That was unnecessary and didn't need to be done. That is my view.
Okay. EU leaders who were not, for the most part, native English speakers, specifically researched and found out about the British phrase, the English language phrase, I think peculiar to England, you can't have your cake and eat it. And that specific phrase, which had been repeated many times by people like Guy Verhofstadt and other negotiators, was adopted by the Brexiteers and reversed and turned into what Boris Johnson coined as the phrase cakeism. In other words, saying we can have it both ways. And a very specific example. So the difficulty with what you are suggesting is international law, because WTO rules say that there is what's called most favored nation status. You cannot, which is not very favored, by the way. It's just essentially not having sanctions against you. And when you're not in a formal trade agreement, such as the EU, you can't pick and choose rules for this country and that country. And the reason why that is against international law is because that would allow essentially favoritism and sanctions by the back door and corruption, essentially. So, for example, the EU has a tariff, I think, of about 25 cents a litre on the import of milk from third countries. The EU was entirely happy with Britain in the way that Switzerland is staying in the single market, and Britain insisted on leaving the single market, which meant that by international law, the EU must impose the same tariff on British milk or UK milk coming into the EU as they do to Belarusian or any other third country products. And they're not allowed to wobble that around and make these very finite, fine-grained rules. The difficulty then is that a third of all of the milk produced in Northern Ireland is imported raw into the south. Farmers cannot pay to feed cattle and throw away their milk. Northern Ireland doesn't have the processing capacity to process it, and the only option on the next day, I think on the 1st of February, the only option that Northern Ireland farmers would have been to shoot 1/3 of their cows if Britain had not made that. And the EU bent over backwards and made an agreement and made derogations. And the notion that because the EU will not essentially thumb its nose to international law, that constitutes punishing Britain is really difficult for anyone here to listen to. And it sounds like nonsense. And it sounds like the sort of me, the whole world revolves around me type attitude that is, the worst of the British tabloids.
Yeah, I mean, again, you sort of set up these examples. I mean,
I didn't set them up. They exist.
No, but I'm saying you sort of pick these things. The reality is, and Geir Hofstadt, by the way, was one of the most toxic individuals when it came to his language about the UK, Boris Johnson and Brexit. So I don't think choosing Guy Hofstadt,
really toxic, more toxic than David Davis, more toxic than
member of the EU. The guy was incredibly toxic, and anybody can look at his Twitter feed and they'll understand what I mean. Anyway, the broader question is, the EU has made plenty of exceptions, whether its relationship is through the form of the EEA with Switzerland, whether it's EFTA relationship in Scandinavia. Given the size of the UK and its importance as a trading partner, it could have created its own version or a hybrid version of both of those. Now, if I was involved in any negotiation, that's certainly the direction of travel I would have wanted to go.
They'd have set up an international treaty organization for trade just for the UK.
I didn't want. Yes, yeah. I mean, it makes plenty of exceptions before, and as
the exceptions are not allowed under WTO. They must have a formal trading partnership.
Yes, we could have had reasonable formal trade agreement, as I said, a hybrid relationship that was neither fully blown in the single market nor EFTA nor EEA. We could have done that, but we didn't end up doing that. And I still think that we can do that. There's no reason why we can't do that. But that needs a willingness on both sides, rather than what I would view and many people in Britain view is this constant wanting to punish. And I use that word punish.
What evidence do you have for that? Can you give me one example of punishment?
I have given you many examples now of the language in meetings that I have been into with EU officials who have constantly used two phrases. One, we want to punish Britain for leaving. Number two, we don't want to make it easy for you when you leave to have a trading relationship with us, because they don't want to set the precedent for example, a Frexit or an Italians leaving their version and so on. So they don't want to do that. I'm afraid you need to go speak to EU officials and get underneath the skin rather than listen to what they say on the surface. Goes back to earlier in our discussion. That is why I like to travel around countries and to get in there and meet and talk to people, because it's only then when you get underneath the skin of the surface rhetoric that you begin to understand the motives of people. And I'm saying to you, and particularly the Geir Verhofstadts of this world, did want to punish Britain, continue want to punish Britain, and want to gloat in any economic failure that Britain has. He does not wish Britain well in ourselves, either as an independent country and so on. And I find it sort of fascinating that we're having this discussion when I suspect there are many of your listeners here who would want, for example, to be a unified island of Ireland, fully independent from the United Kingdom. And it's that same emotional, visceral feeling that those of us who are part of the United Kingdom, not that I'm trying to mix and match both at this stage, felt about the EU. We feel as strongly as about that, as I suspect people do in SNP. The Scottish nationalists feel the same way, and they're going to struggle as well, in the same way that the United Kingdom itself is struggling, and its relationship with Europe, as we have tried to break away from the EU. I suspect if the SNP got their way and won their vote, they're going to find it challenging to have their own independent economic policy, for example, with their own currency, because it's going to be very difficult for them to survive outside of the sterling zone, if you will, without being fully accepted into the Eurozone. And so, and there's the wider issue of then the EU supporting what Scotland wants and setting precedents for an independent Catalonia and other areas within countries in Europe where there are other independence movements. So it is a complicated situation. But as I said, my view is if I had gone about this, and I think if there'd been a better willingness on both sides to have a constructive, proactive trading relationship, we could have ended up in a better place than we are. But as you say, we are where we are. It is economically uncomfortable at this stage. Do I think in 5 years' time things will be much better for us? As things settle down, as the world economy settles down, and as we continue to find our own way in the broader outside world, the answer is yes. I think things will be better for us in 5 years. In 5 years.
Brooks Newmark, former British Conservative Party MP, former minister in various ministries that I just don't understand, currently an academic, very interested in public and international affairs. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Okay, thank you again. And we wish everybody a happy Christmas.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter @Here's How Podcast, and follow Brooks Newmark @Brooks Newmark. And get in touch if you want to suggest a guest or a topic that we should cover in the coming year. Thanks again to all of the patrons. As I said, it gives us a hand to keep our little labour of love going on the internet. And if you could do the same as those patrons and make a New Year's resolution to give us a dig out once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/here's how. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The co-producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.